Hello, my name is Wojtek Popielarz, and I am Global Regulatory Affairs Manager working for Reckitt Benckiser. The topic I'm going to talk today about is Annex 8 to the CLP regulation. This is a very important topic right now for two reasons. First of all, it improves the emergency health response provided to consumers in need, but it is also important because its implementation deadline is in circa 6 months, so it's important for industry to prepare for new requirements. Before I move to the main part of my presentation, I will first talk a little bit about the company I work for. So Reckitt Benckiser is a truly global company. We are present in 60 countries across 6 continents, and we are selling our products in more than 190 countries. Reckitt Benckiser is the company which is behind such an iconic brands as Finish, Vanish, Dettol, Sealit Bang. And what's important for this presentation to know is that all these brands are impacted and have to comply with Annex 8 to the CLP regulation. Now, with regards to the main part of my presentation, I'm going to go very quickly through the recap on Annex 8, although I'm sure during this conference this has already been widely covered. I'm going to very briefly talk about history and the latest developments for Annex 8, and the most important part of my presentation will be to give you some hints into the notifier's perspective as to the Annex 8. I'm going to finish this off with some conclusions. So as to the recap, basically the reason we have to notify those products to poison centers is because sometimes there's an accidental exposure to hazardous chemicals at workplace and home. And it is crucial for medical staff to have access to information about those chemicals. The key principles, if I am to summarize it in 2 sentences, industry is responsible for the data about the products they placed on the market and for providing this data to the poison centers, and poison centers are responsible for processing that data and providing adequate health response to consumers. The deadline of the new legislation is 1st January 2021 for consumer and professional mixtures and 1st January 2024 for industrial mixtures. These are the timings where the new harmonized requirements come into force. So we have came a long way. So notification to poison centers has been around since a long time. However, there has been some significant updates made only in the recent past 2 years. They have followed after some workability issues that has been highlighted by both poison centers in the industry. Those workability issues in many cases has been resolved, and that results in the legislation being amended in the, even as we speak right now, there are discussions about the draft of second amendment to Annex 8, which is supposed to be published closer to the end of the year. This means that industry will have quite a little time to adapt to the new requirements. So as I mentioned in the previous slides, that there have been some workability issues which has been highlighted in the past. For detergent industry, the key ones were insufficient time to implement and assimilate the notification tools after the publication of the new legislation. Fortunately, there has been a postponement achieved and the new implementation deadline of 1st January 2021 has been established. One of the key issues for detergent industry was irregular product variations that currently occur within the detergent products. I think the legislation underestimated the complexity of those, what most of people may think simple products, and the complexity of supply chain. The reality is that the raw materials that we are using within the detergents can vary in their discrete compositions, and those raw materials are currently used interchangeably, and we rely on those interchangeability of those raw materials to keep our production going, which is even more important, especially now when we see such a growth of demand for detergent products worldwide. Fortunately, there has been an ICG concept, interchangeable component group concept, agreed in the second amendment to Annex 8, which is currently being discussed and expected to be published in the second half of the year. The other issue that our industry has experienced is certain lack of clarity around the UFI location. Fortunately, the legislation has clarified in the First Amendment that the industry has quite a lot of flexibility as to where they are going to locate the UFI, whether it's on the artwork itself, on the packaging, and whether it's in some close proximity to the main CLP information. So that development has been very welcomed by industry. Last but not least, there is the concept of generic product identifier included in Annex 8. Unfortunately, this concept is not very usable for detergent industry because it is limited only to non-hazardous fragrances and dyes. The reality of the situation is that most fragrances which are used within the detergent industry are rather complex hazardous mixtures, and therefore that will mean that the industry will have to disclose even up to 200 components of their fragrances in the submission, which will make it much more complicated. So the type of the questions that industry needs to ask themselves in this time, half a year before the implementation deadline, if you haven't asked those questions yet, is, do you really understand all the requirements well? Do you know when to start implementing new requirements? Do you know if any of your products are exempted? Do you know your role in the supply chain and your resulting obligations? Last but not least, do you know all necessary information about chemistry of your product and any other information about your product which are necessary to perform a submission to poison control centers? Right, the processes and systems are also important. You need to know what system you're going to use in order to perform the notifications, whether it's going to be internal ECHA portal or whether you're going to use a system-to-system solution. Annex 8 is quite a vast piece of regulation, so I'm just going to focus here on some hints which I thought were most important for the type of industry I work for. It's important to realize that the suppliers of detergent industry also need to comply by 1st January 2021. Because the raw materials are supplied to be used in consumer products, they are treated as consumer product type products, and the same deadline applies to them. There are certain exemptions which needs to be contemplated. So you don't have to notify to poison centers non-classified products or products only classified for environmental or supplemental hazard endpoints only. However, you may entertain an idea of voluntary submissions, which are possible according to the legislation. I thought it was quite important that the rules for amending the notifications can be quite complex. Not every change that you are making within your product will qualify for a change of your notification immediately or a change in the UFI. So for example, if you change the concentration of your ingredients within notified range, or you change the packaging or notifier address, these are the changes that you don't have to notify to the poison centers immediately before you place the product on the market. Also, it's important to realize the UFI only changes when the composition changes. So other changes that you are making to your notification may not impact necessarily the UFI code. If you are using the mixtures in mixtures UFI, it is important to note that change is only driven by changes to composition. So if your supplier changes UFI for any other reason than compositional changes, you don't have to amend your UFI. Communicating within supply chain has never been more important. You have to verify if you have any gaps in the knowledge of your raw material full composition. You have to remember that your suppliers may be claiming trade secrets, and while before it may have not been necessary for you to know precisely the composition of your raw material, it may be now. You have to check if your supplier UFI is linked with notification before you use it. This is because there is a possibility of voluntary disclosure of UFI on the labels, even if it is not linked with a solid notification. You should not use a UFI that isn't linked with a notification, because that will not allow poison control centers to perform their desired activity. You have to remember that use of mixture-in-mixture UFI is conditional. Disclosure of full composition generally takes precedence. If you cannot get hold of the full composition of your mixture-in-mixture, a raw material as we call it within the industry, you can consider using the safety data sheet and information from that safety data sheet. But if you use mixture-in-mixture UFI, you have to remember that that mixture-in-mixture should have been notified for your use type and should have been notified in all markets that you intend to use. I'm going to demonstrate it a little bit in few cases that I have prepared in further slides. And finally, it's very important that you engage within your supply chain. When there are trade secrets being imposed, you have to sign non-disclosure agreements with your supplier to obtain compositional information, if that's the preferred option within your supply chain. You have to obtain mixture-in-mixture UFI ahead of implementation deadlines, if you need them. So as I mentioned before, the same deadlines may apply to you as well as to your suppliers. It is important to have that conversation in order to obtain those UFIs early enough for you to implement the new requirements. Last but not least, it's important to discuss substance hazard classification within supply chain. As we all know, not all substances classifications are currently harmonized under Annex 6 of CLP. That means the suppliers may have different data on the substances and they may disclose different classification of the same substances. It is important that you discuss with your suppliers and understand what the classification is, because that's a condition for interchangeable use of components in your notification to poison centers. So the case 1 here demonstrates that industry will have a certain decisions to make, and they not always are that straightforward when it comes to the notification to poison control centers. So in this case, a supplier is making a raw material, let's call it a raw material A, and it is non-hazard, non-classified mixture. Supplier let know to downstream user that there is a hazardous component within that mixture, but he claims trade secret on the rest of the composition. So a downstream user then incorporates a raw material A into its hazardous product. The concentration of raw material A is quite significant. In terms of supplier of raw material A, he has no obligation to notify poison control centers as his raw material is not classified. He doesn't even need to provide SDS for non-classified raw material, and he's claiming trade secret on the composition. So downstream users has certain options. So they can either ask supplier for voluntary poison control center submission in all member states that the downstream user intends to market the product, and then use the supplier mixture-in-mixture UFI. And the other option is the supplier have a right to ask for SDS because the mixture contains more than 1% of hazardous component, in which case supplier should provide SDS on request, and downstream user may use the information from the SDS to provide in the notification to poison control centers. The other case demonstrates different roles within the supply chain and different considerations to be taken into account. So again, supplier of raw material A provides a hazardous product to the formulator, which makes a consumer mixture. Then this mixture is being provided further to a distributor who wants to sell it to professional users in additional markets. So in this case, a supplier A notified, let's say, only in Portugal and Spain. They included industrial and consumer use type in the PCC notification, and they did provide UFI within SDS downstream. Formulator decided that he has all necessary compositional information about the raw material, and therefore they break it down into components and they don't have to rely on supplier notifications and their UFI. They make its own notifications in, let's say, Austria, Germany, and France for consumer use type, and he provides UFI further downstream to the distributor. However, distributor wants to market in additional places and additionally for a professional use. So distributor have an option to contact with a formulator, so the formulator amend original notification to include additional markets and professional end use, or they can perform notification in additional markets for professional use on its own. Implementation of Annex 8 means that there will be certain strategic decisions that if you haven't already made in your company, I think that it's the high time that you do make those decisions. So UFI is considered the supplemental label information, and as a result, you have a freedom to choose its location and placement on your product. So the decisions that you have to make is whether you want to print your UFI online, but that may mean that you'll have to put significant investment in printing capabilities in your factories. Additionally, you'll have to ensure there are appropriate quality checks being done in your factory. Or you can decide to include UFI as part of your artworks, but that will mean additional cost when UFI needs changing. It is industry responsibility to ensure notification data and UFI matches with their internal records. What that means is that company has a freedom to choose whether they are going to use their own integrated systems, which will mean significant investment because you may need to pay more money to your contractors responsible for those systems to accommodate Annex 8 requirements, or you may decide to choose ECA notification portal, but this may mean lose a bit of efficiency. Last but not least, it's important to think about what type of process you're going to use within your organization. So ask yourself question, who will be responsible for generation of UFIs and notification forms? And most importantly, how the information will flow between different departments within your company. It is very important to start planning implementation early. So you need to know exactly what products fall under the requirements of an organization. You need to account for those which are existing and also those which you plan to place on the market in the near future. I advise that you make use of transitional period, but only when it makes sense. We have to remember that this legislation has to be implemented, and delaying is not always the best option. You should try to combine poison control notifications with other unusual business activities. So if you have any new product developments, formula reworks, or rebranding activities in your pipeline, you may consider whether it's the right time for implementation of UFI on your products. The key point is that good planning will minimize economic impact to your business, but it will also minimize environmental waste. So, to wrap up this presentation, I would want to present you with some conclusions. So, PCC notifications and their harmonization will certainly improve emergency health response in Europe. Central use of ECA notification portal or systems-to-systems solutions could definitely drive some efficiency. However, it is important to note that in general, number of notifications is expected to significantly increase due to stringent thresholds included into the Annex 8, as well as the rules for changes to the notifications which go beyond those in many markets today. The key for industry is to understand the impact, engage with supplier, and adapt their systems and processes, and to plan implementation in advance. Thank you for your attention.